Betty Schwengels. This is the Carnegie Museum, and it is April the 9th of the year 2000. That's for the benefit of the camera. We're so glad you came this afternoon. We have a great treat in store for you. Mr. and Mrs. Essick have come over from Ottumwa and brought all this wonderful equipment with them. And I have a feeling this is only a small part of what they have, probably. But I want to read you a little bit from the thing that was in the paper because there's something in it that struck me as very funny when I read it. It says that they are members of the Wapello County, Wapello Questers and the Ottumwa Civil War Roundtable. Well, that's enough to keep you busy if you didn't do anything else. They are history buffs. They are antique collectors. He is a firefighter for the city of Ottumwa. She is a teacher at Indian Hills Community College. And then it says, in their spare time, they are redoing the house that they lived in, which was built in 1855. And that business about spare time fascinates me. I do that. Anyway, they're going to give us a treat this afternoon with the original music, the original instruments, and the whole business of the music from the Civil War. Mr. and Mrs. Essick.
Well, we thank you for inviting us this afternoon. It's always fun for us to come and share our hobby with other people who enjoy antiques and history too. Before we start on the program, Dale's going to tell you a little bit about the different phonographs and the music box that we brought along with us today.
Okay, I'm sure most of you are fairly well familiar with machines like this, so you don't see them anymore, because there aren't even any records anymore of any kind, other than CDs and DVDs and such. But this first machine here is a 1902 Victor, or 1906 Victor 2, excuse me. And the model of designation 2, they had them numbered 1 through 6, and then some other various machines. But this machine cost $32.50 in 1906, and it was, for then, music was a novelty yet. But, as you can see, they hadn't yet got to the internal horn machines yet in 1906. They didn't come out until about 1908 or 1909. But this was kind of what the everyday middle-class person could afford, would be something like this. And this is a Edison Home from 1906. It was more expensive machine, but it played the cylinder records instead of the flat disc records. Some of you probably haven't seen these before. Edison liked these instead of the disc records, and he didn't want to go to the disc records. He was a brilliant man, but he was pretty set in his ways, and he didn't want to change from, and it eventually cost him the company because he did come out with a disc machine, but it was one that would only play his record and wouldn't play any of the other flat discs. So they did last until 1929, Edison did, before they went totally bankrupt. And this machine cost $35 in 1906, but it wouldn't have been, this horn here would have been extra. That would have been with just a plain black horn. But that horn would have only been maybe $3 then. Not so now. And this is a Euphonia music box from approximately 1905. You can't find a whole lot of information on them because this was a pretty obscure brand for music boxes. And music boxes, if you're not familiar, they play a flat metal disc that has projections on the back. And when the disc goes around, it trips little star wheels that pluck the teeth on what's called a comb that has teeth on it that are all tuned. And that's how it makes the music. And I would expect this probably cost $25 or $30 back in 1905. But this is 1905 was just about the end of the music boxes because the phonographs were taking over. The last machine here is a was made in 1912 by Edison. It's called Fireside, and it was one of the cheaper models. But by then, the price had increased enough that this one still costs $32 in 1912. But by then, Edison was making celluloid cylinders. Instead of the first cylinders were wax, and they changed, but they were too breakable, and you could only play them a few times and they'd wear out. So they went to the celluloid material, so they're pretty well indestructible, except over the years the celluloid shrinks and they crack. And a lot of them were, by this age, are starting to crack apart and split and not be usable anymore. But still, that was the only thing that really saved the cylinder machine, is when they went to the celluloid cylinders. And they actually still made these cylinders clear up through 1927. But they quit making the machines that probably, the cylinder machines, I think the last ones were made about 1924, 1925. And then they were all inside horn machines. There weren't any outside horn machines by then. And that's about it.
Okay. Dale spent many hours in the museum when he was a boy. He grew up at Libertyville and graduated from Fairfield High School. So this is kind of neat for him to come to the museum again with our phonographs and share this afternoon with you. So this afternoon we're going to tell you the story of the Civil War in song. I think everybody would agree that the Civil War was one of the most pivotal events in our nation's history. Historians might even say it played an unprecedented role in shaping our national character. During this time, brothers were fighting against brothers, slaves were fighting their masters, gentlewomen were smuggling and spying, and all kinds of things were going on as this great upheaval swept across the country. Masters and slaves, soldiers and sailors, daughters and sons, Republicans and Democrats, mothers and fathers, all of them shared a deep emotional commitment to this war and to the war effort, which was reflected in the songs of the day. And so today we have this wonderful heritage of music that came from the 1860 era. Songs that you probably sang in elementary school, like The Yellow Rose of Texas and Shoo Fly Don't Bother Me, and Listen to the Mockingbird and Goober Peas. All of these songs had their origin in the Civil War. And beautiful haunting melodies like Aura Lee, which we know the tune today as Elvis Presley's Love Me Tender. And another song called Lorena. They still reach across all of those years and touch us today with their poignancy and grace. This afternoon, we're going to trace the history of the Civil War in song. Some of the tunes you'll recognize easily, others of them may be new to you, but I think you'll agree with us that as you listen to those songs, you can almost feel the emotions that those folks did who lived back in the 1860s and who had so much courage and determination that our nation exists today because of the sacrifices they made then. America in the 1860s was really pretty much a youngster among nations yet. The earliest immigrants to our country, the English and Scottish and Irish settlers, their heritage became mixed with the German and French immigrants who came later, and those in turn were mixed with the Negro spirituals of the slaves who came not of their own accord. And all of those together formed a unique American sound and a unique American music. By the 1850s, the most typical kind of song that was heard were songs that reflected the plight of the black slaves. A lot of Stephen Foster songs were popular, and minstrel shows traveled all over the country with blackface performers singing these songs and sharing the message of the poor black slaves. This was the same time that Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, and of course that whipped up a lot of public sentiment against the slaveholders in the South. And during this era, Old Folks at Home came to be recognized as one of the most popular songs in the pre-Civil War years. Incidentally, this song, as we know, was written by Stephen Foster, but when it first came out, he refused to attach his name to that song because of the strong prejudice of what was called Ethiopian music. But when he realized that people liked the song, even though it was what was called Ethiopian music, he quickly reclaimed authorship, and today we know Old Folks at Home is one of Stephen Foster's most famous songs. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 was really the beginning of the end of the Union, because when he was elected, the southern states began to secede. And they formed their own nation. They called it the Confederacy and chose Jefferson Davis as their president. At his inauguration, the most popular of all Southern songs, Dixieland, was played in 1861. Dixie was written by one of the black-faced minstrels who appeared in vaudevillian shows, Daniel Decatur Emmett, 2 years before that. He needed a song for his minstrel show, and this is what he came up with. And it was introduced then in New Orleans in 1860, and from there it spread all throughout the South and just kind of was adopted as their theme song. It was kind of sad for Emmett because he was a Northerner and he definitely had Union sympathies, but here he came to be identified with the most famous song of all in the South. The North tried to recapture Dixie by writing new lyrics, but that didn't work. Dixie remained a Southern song forever. You know some other songs that Dan Emmett wrote. I'm sure some of you have sung The Blue-Tailed Fly and Old Dan Tucker. But despite the popularity of his songs and how they've lasted over the years, he himself died penniless at the age of 89. Dixieland. Just as Dixie came to symbolize the Southern effort, so another song came just as much to be closely identified with the North, and that was the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Incidentally, I think it's kind of ironic to note that this song was written by a man named William Steffi, who was a Southerner and wrote Sunday school songs. And the most famous song of the South was written by a Northerner, so it's kind of ironic the way it turned out. And what we commonly think of as an offshoot of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, the song John Brown's Body Lies a Mouldering in the Grave, those words were written before the words to the Battle Hymn were. And they weren't written about John Brown, the abolitionist of Harper's Ferry fame. They were written about a John Brown who was the second sergeant in a Massachusetts volunteer infantry, and he was a Scottish man. He's also the second tenor in the Glee Club. So his men thought it was real funny to make up verses about their sergeant, John Brown, and so that's how that song got started. And they thought it was even funnier then when everybody thought that the song was written about the Harper's Ferry John Brown and not the old sergeant. And people didn't know about this song until 1861, when these Massachusetts volunteer infantry marched down Broadway in New York City singing John Brown's Body Lies a Mouldering in the Grave, and pretty soon that song then was adopted all over in the North because of its popular marching rhythm. One night then in the fall of 1861, a woman named Julia Ward Howe, who was a very prominent New England socialite, was with her husband, who was a member of the Military Sanitary Commission, and part of his job was to go around to Army camps and check things out. Well, one night they were sitting with the troops singing songs around the campfire, and they sang John Brown's Body. And one of Julia's friends said, well, why don't you write some new lyrics to that song? And so she went to bed that night, and the next morning this is what she wrote in her diary. In spite of the excitement of the day, I went to bed and slept as usual, but awoke next morning in the gray of the early dawn, and to my astonishment found that the wished-for lines were arranging themselves in my brain. I lay quite still until the last verse had completed itself in my thoughts, then hastily arose, saying to myself, I shall lose this if I don't write it down immediately. I searched for an old sheet of paper and the stump of a pen which I'd had the night before and began to scrawl the lines almost without looking. Having completed this, I lay down again and fell asleep, but not without thinking that something of great importance had happened to me. Well, indeed, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, I think, was of great importance. It was published the following February in the Atlantic Monthly, and from then it was published in many Army hymnals and magazines throughout the country. Julia was paid $5 for her effort. And it was said that the first time President Lincoln heard this song, he wept and begged that the performance be repeated. It touched him so much. The Battle Hymn of the Republic.
You have to excuse this recording here. It was such a popular song that all the records have been played and played and played. It's hard to find a good early copy. You can find later ones, but not with the early singers singing it. This is Frank Stanley singing it. So excuse the scratchy sound and skips and so forth.
The actual fighting in the Civil War started in April of 1861 when Fort Sumter was fired upon. And it didn't take the American sheet music industry very long. Within 3 days, they had a piece of sheet music out called "The First Gun is Fired, May God Protect the Right." I think that is so interesting that it sounds like something so terribly modern that within 3 days they already had sheet music published and ready for people to buy. And about this time, a vaudevillian named Harry McCarthy came up with a song called "The Bonnie Blue Flag," which has come to be the second most popular song of the Confederacy. Now, nobody knows for sure what his inspiration was. Some people say he attended the Mississippi Secession Convention, and there a man unfurled this gigantic blue silk flag with a single white star that his wife had sewn, and so that was the inspiration. And other people say, no, Harry McCarthy was at the South Carolina Secession Convention, and that's their state flag, and that's where he got the inspiration. But still other sources say he just needed a song for his vaudeville show, and this is what he came up with. So whatever the source of inspiration, Bonnie Blue Flag quickly caught on and was very popular throughout the South. In fact, it was so popular that when General Ben Butler was in charge of the martial law in the city of New Orleans, he fined every man, woman, or child $25 if they even whistled this song, because he thought it was such an explosive song. He also destroyed the printing press and fined the publisher $500 for even publishing this piece of music, the Bonnie Blue Flag. Now, calls went out for volunteers as both the North and the South geared up for the fighting that was ahead of them. And the new soldiers had to get used to a new routine. Planting and harvesting were replaced by drilling and marching so that they could become effective soldiers. The war was little more than a year old when George F. Root wrote another very famous song of the Civil War years, the Battle Cry of Freedom, or what we sometimes know as Rally Round the Flag. This song was memorialized in many Civil War era diaries and reminiscences for the effect that it had on the Northern troops. One Union soldier wrote in his diary about how low morale was, and then he said a glee club from Chicago came and sang this song for their troops, and this is what he wrote. It ran through the camp like wildfire. The effect was little short of miraculous. It put as much spirit and cheer into the camp as a splendid victory. Day and night you could hear it by every campfire and in every tent. Well, of course, the Confederate view was just the opposite, and one Confederate soldier wrote this in his diary. "'Twas a nasty night during the 7 days' fight, and if I remember it rightly, it was raining. I was on picket when just before taps, some fellow on the other side struck up that song and others joined in the chorus until it seemed to me the whole Yankee army was singing. Now, I'm not naturally superstitious, but I tell you, that song sounded to me like the knell of doom, and my heart went down into my boots." Well, within 2 years of this being published, it had sold over 350,000 copies of sheet music, which was a lot back in the 1860s. President Lincoln told George Root, "You have done more than 100 generals and 1,000 orators." His song still remains very stirring to us even after 140 years as we listen to the battle cry of freedom. As the Civil War dragged on and began its second year, it became apparent to people that this wasn't just going to be over real quick. It was going to last for the long haul. And America's songwriters began to reflect that rather dismal prospect with some of the songs they wrote. There were many soldiers killed and wounded and maimed, and some of the songwriters wrote about those. There was one song called "The Empty Sleeve," about a soldier who'd lost his arm, and there's another one called "Old Arm Goodbye." And there was still another one called "Will You Wed Me Now I'm Lame, Love?" But despite all those rather grim kind of songs, there were other songs. In fact, the most famous songs were directed towards mother. Now, in our rather more sophisticated age today, it's hard for us to imagine the appeal a song like "Just Before the Battle, Mother" would have had. But it seemed to touch a chord in people on both sides of the line, and in fact, it sold over 1 million sheet music copies. This is the same composer as the song you just heard, "Rally Round the Flag." This is George F. Root again, "Just Before the Battle, Mother."
Thank you.
Now, the folks back home weren't the only ones who were singing songs during the Civil War. The soldiers themselves sang a lot of songs too. They sang a lot of songs, the same songs as the folks back home sang, but they also sang some just soldier-type songs, and most of those were songs of complaint. And if you've ever been in the service, you probably know that there were things to complain about. There was one song to the tune of America that went like this: "My rations are SB, taken from porkers 3,000 years old, and hardtack cut and dried long before Noah died. From what was left aside, ne'er can be told." Other songs bemoaned the lack of feminine companionship and the overabundance of insect companionship. One song to the tune of Sweet By and By went like this: "Soldiers sing of their beans and canteens, of the coffee and old army cup. Why not mention the small friends we've seen, always trying to chew armies up? Those firm friends, tireless friends, hardly ever neglecting their hugs. Their regard never ends, how they love us, those old army bugs." "Tenting Tonight," or "Tenting on the Old Campground," was another song that soldiers sang together. It was popular on both sides of the line, and it's reported that officers had to tell their men to stop singing that at night for fear of giving away their position on the battlefield. It was such a popular song. It was written by a man named Walter Kittredge, and he was inspired to write it when he got his draft notice. But he had rheumatic fever when he was a child, so he couldn't serve in the army, so he tried to sell this song as part of his contribution to the war effort. And at first he couldn't find a publisher because it wasn't patriotic and military enough. But when the Hutchinson Singing Group popularized his song and sang it at vaudeville shows, pretty soon people began to really like it, and so "Tenting Tonight" was eventually published and sold a lot of sheet music copies as well. It was one of the most popular songs to be sung at GAR reunions following the war. "Tenting Tonight." Now, not every soldier was fortunate enough to come through battles unscathed, and for those who were taken prisoner, they often thought of their fate as one worse than death in the likes of Andersonville or Libby Prison. And it was during this time in the 1863 that George F. Root wrote the song "Tramp, Tramp, Tramp" as a tribute to those who were taken prisoner. It came just at a time when many, many folks were worried about their loved ones who hadn't come home and hadn't been reported dead, so they knew that they probably were in prison somewhere. And then it was even picked up by the soldiers themselves as a marching song, because you can see how Tramp, Tramp, Tramp would be good to walk to. Like George F. Root's other songs, it's kind of touched an emotional chord among all the folks back in the 1860s, so it was a very popular song back then. Tramp, Tramp, Tramp. Oh, and if you have gone to Sunday school, you will probably recognize this song, because if you sang the song, Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, this is the same tune as George Root's song.
In the prison cell I sit, thinking, Mother dear, of you, and our bright and happy home so far away. And the tears, they fill my eyes, fight of all that I can do, so I try to cheer my comrades and be gay. Tramp, 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 the boys are marching, cheer up, comrades, they would go. And beneath the starry flag, we shall breathe the air again, all the free and in our own beloved home.
Now, perhaps the most pivotal and certainly one of the most hallowed battles of the Civil War was the first 3 days of July 1863, Gettysburg. After the battle was over, the folks in Gettysburg decided they'd like to turn a small portion at the edge of the battlefield into a national cemetery. So they planned a dedication ceremony in November of 1863. They invited the most famous orator in the country at that time. His name was Edward Everett, and he was asked to give the address 2 months ahead of time. And only 2 weeks ahead of time did they ask President Lincoln to come and say a few words of dedication for the new cemetery. President Lincoln was suffering a mild case of smallpox when he went to Gettysburg that day, and so he wasn't feeling well at all when he rode on the train. And when he got to the place of the dedication ceremony, Edward Everett gave a 2-hour speech. President Lincoln got up to give his portion. He had 269 words arranged in 10 sentences, which he delivered in less than 3 minutes. But still, his words are the ones we recall even today.
A new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world with little note no longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is
Now, with death and destruction at every turn and the war dragging on into its 4th year, America's songwriters came up with a lot of sad and desperately depressing songs, and one of the most was a song called "Who Will Care for Mother Now?" It was written by a man named Charles Sawyer, and it's been described as being a milestone of melodic melancholia. He even came up with a supposedly true story on which this song was based. He wrote, "During one of our late battles, among many other noble fellows that fell, was a young man who'd been the only support of an aged and sick mother for years. Hearing the surgeon tell those who were near him that he could not live, he placed his hand across his forehead, and with a trembling voice said, with tears rolling down his cheeks, "Who will care for Mother now?" So with such a great big buildup, and I think it's so interesting that songwriters used the same techniques back then that they do now. But he had these wonderful syrupy lyrics and an overly sweet tune, and this song went high in popularity. People all over liked it, and it too sold over 1 million sheet music copies on both sides of the line. It was so extremely popular. And incidentally, no other Civil War song garnered so many replies as this one to answer the question, who will care for Mother now? You'll hear an angel being described in the chorus of this song, and so many songs were written to reply to the angel that somehow, some way, Mother would indeed be taken care of. Now, military exploits were often extolled in song and poem during the Civil War years, and one of the most famous was a ride by General Phil Sheridan in September of 1864. Sheridan defeated Confederate Lieutenant General Jubal Early at Winchester, Virginia, and then he chased Early on to 20 years away to a place called Fisher's Hill, where Early tried to stretch his line out and hold the upper Shenandoah Valley. Well, he didn't have enough people, only 900 soldiers, and Sheridan was able easily to defeat him. So these two victories at Winchester and at Fisher's Hill came at a good time for President Lincoln, because this is right in the re-election campaign, so this gave his campaign some much needed victories and helped him to be re-elected to a second term. This poem, we're going to listen to the whole recording of this because it is so funny how the narrator on the poem gets more and more excited the closer that Sheridan gets to Fisher's Hill. And first he'll be 20 miles away, and then he'll be 15 miles away, and then 10, and then 5, and you can hear how the excitement rises in his voice the closer that Sheridan gets to Early at Fisher's Hill.
Up from the south at break of day, waiting to reach his
Now, doesn't that just want to make you stand up and cheer? The most dramatic military campaign of the Civil War was General William Tecumseh Sherman's march through Georgia to the sea. From a military point, it was rather daring. It took Sherman and his troops right through the middle of Georgia. It cut off General Lee's supply lines because of the destruction of so many miles of railroad tracks that the troops were able to accomplish. And it also had another effect. It brought the war to the heart of the Deep South for the first time. That section of the South had been spared any actual fighting, but now with Sherman there, it was also a battlefield. On the first day of winter, December 21st, 1864, Sherman captured the city of Savannah, and he sent President Lincoln a telegram. I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 guns and plenty of ammunition and 25,000 bales of cotton. So throughout the South, everyone was jubilant because they realized that this was the beginning of the end of the war, that finally the war years would be over. A number of songs were written to celebrate Sherman's march through Georgia, and the most famous was Henry Clay Work's Marching Through Georgia. It tells of the spirit of the Union soldiers and how happy the blacks were that the Union was coming to free them, and how happy the prisoners of war were that they too were being freed. And it was interesting to note that this song was played after the war whenever General Sherman appeared to speak. And he is said to have commented, if I'd have known I was going to have to hear that song so many times, I would have never made that march through Georgia. Probably even today, there's no song that is so hated in the South, in some areas of the South, as this song still is, because it carries with it the feeling still of the scorched earth campaign of Sherman. So it still generates a lot of bad feelings still today. But you'll notice at the very beginning of this how the sound is very dim, and then as the soldiers get closer, the volume will increase. In 1865, as the Civil War drew to a close with Lee's surrender, one final song came to epitomize the plight of the black people, and that was Kingdom Coming. This song was written, too, by Henry Clay Work. He kind of looked a bit like the guys on the Smith Brothers cough drops box. That's what he appeared like. And he was always had songs on the equivalent of the top 10 list back in the 1860s. And he also wrote the song Grandfather's Clock, which I'm sure lots of you remember from singing when you were young. But his most famous songs were these patriotic and military ones. And he wrote Kingdom Coming, and it was adopted by especially the black soldiers who marched into Richmond the closing days of the war singing this song. And after the war was over, interestingly enough, many white Southerners seemed to take up this song. But you will recognize the tune very readily, especially those of you who grew up in the 50s and 60s and watched cartoons on TV. You'll know where this song came from.
clown. His coat so big he could take him and it won't go halfway around. He drills so much they call him Captain and he gets so dreadful tan. I bet he's trying to them Yankees for the big he's contraband. Just off he run.
You couldn't listen to that other song without cheering, and you can't listen to that one without laughing, I don't think. Well, with the collapse of the Confederacy, a great wave of relief spread across the country as the war-weary nation finally could rest. The stirring martial songs of wartime gave way to hymns of peace and reconciliation, but it was very difficult for the South to reach out to the hand that was extended from the North. They were embittered, they were hurting, much of their land and way of making a living had been destroyed. So it was very, very difficult for them to embrace any kind of brotherhood with their former friends and brothers from the North. In early 1867, though, in Columbus, Mississippi, an incident occurred that seemed to strike maybe a new beginning for the United States, and it was reported in the New York Tribune. The women of Columbus, Mississippi, animated by nobler sentiments than many of their sisters, have shown themselves impartial in their offerings made to the memory of the dead. They strewed flowers alike on the graves of the Confederate and of the national soldiers. Now, it's hard for us today to imagine the electric effect that had, because strewing flowers seems like such a simple thing. But to have those women put flowers on the graves of the Union soldiers as well as their own graves really touched a chord in the country and made people think about exactly what the war had done and maybe how we could be healed. A man named Francis Miles Finch wrote a poem called The Blue and the Gray, with which we'll close today. By the flow of the inland river, whence the fleets of iron have fled, where the blades of the grave grass quiver, asleep are the ranks of the dead. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day, under the one, the blue, under the other, the gray. From the silence of sorrowful hours, the desolate mourners go, lovingly laden with flowers, alike for friend and foe. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day, under the roses, the blue, under the lilies, the gray. No more shall the war cry sever, or the winding rivers be red. They banished our anger forever when they laureled the graves of our dead. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day, love and tears for the blue, tears and love for the gray. Now that concludes our program, but since I'm a teacher, there always has to be a test. So we have some papers here for you to write your answers on, and we have one more record to play.
Well, you're doing it the wrong way. This way. And, well, okay.
Is there enough? Oh, there's one.
I've got CRA real bad, so don't.
Did everybody get a piece of paper? Okay. Now this record that Dale's going to play is a Berliner, and it's from 1896.
This is 1897. Berliner started making the flat disc records in approximately 1894, but he only just made, it wasn't successful because he couldn't find the right material to record on. And so then by about 1896, then he finally came up with this composition, and it was successful. So this is one of the very first Berliners that was printed. This one was printed in 1897.
It has 3 Civil War era songs on, so we want you to write the titles to these songs. And of course, we have a prize for whoever gets them.
As you can see, they hadn't quite perfected recording yet.
Okay. Did anybody have the first one? When Johnny Comes Marching Home. And the second one?
Can't Count the Races?
Nope. The Girl I Left Behind Me. And the third one was easy. Dixie. Did any?
Yeah. Anybody else get that? The second one?
I didn't hear what it was.
The Girl I Left Behind Me.
You win the prize.
What was the prize?
Yeah, well, of course.
You got that.
We'll give these back.
She get that? Yeah, she had it.
Have any of you, we were just able to play little snippets of the song, so if anybody wants to come up and hear any of the other songs, or if you'd like to try playing any of these machines, we invite you to come up and try them.
I have an ancient copy of it.
Gee.
For the Memorial Day, I used to prepare my class to participate with all the songs, and I promised the students that they would do there.
Taught them well, I'm sure.
There was one of the verses on the Kingdom Come that I thought was cute. There's wine cider in the cellar, and the darkies, they'll have some.
Yeah.
Things will be popping when the Lincoln soldiers come.
And, you know, you got to think that this was back in the time. I mean, it's not quite politically correct today, but then even the blacks sang the same thing. It's so, you know, it's part of our history. That's the only way you can look at it.
Marching for Georgia was never allowed to be played in the National Political Convention.
Anyway, anyone that wants to come up, you can play these if you want to. You can handle them. We don't care. We'll be glad to let you handle them or
Take them home.
take them home. And if the money's right, maybe that.
Would you tell them where you got the discs and the things that you put in, that you have a new one?
Well, these discs here, for this machine, they originally had zinc. The discs for this were originally made out of zinc. These are reproduction discs the guy in California makes. But the zinc ones, the zinc just disintegrates over the years. And so you can't find, for this particular, a lot of the other brands had metal tin ones like these. But this particular brand didn't use tin ones, they used zinc ones, and you just can't find. I've got an original disc, but it sort of played, but not great. You can't find any of them hardly because it's such an obscure make for one thing. And I was just lucky this guy has remade a bunch of these.
Tell us the value of your different machines.
Well, whatever anybody will give for them. Really about it. Well, actually, this machine here is it's quite fancy. If you see the top of the lid, when you come up here and stuff, you can see it's got, most of your disc music boxes are not fancy like this. They're just real plain boxes. This has got real fancy feet on it, and real fancy stuff on the top and sides. And it's probably worth about $3,500. And this machine over here, with this type of horn on it, it's worth, $800 or $900. Right around that. And this is all original except for the crane back, this crane back here is a reproduction. It's not, it's new. They make new parts for all the Edisons and most of the Victors, but your obscure brands they don't make them for.
I think we had a lot of those,
Cylinders? Yeah, the cylinders you can still pick up for anywhere from $1 to $4 a piece.
How many different systems, different types of machines you order, do you know, for cylinders? In other words, you can't play this cylinder on that machine probably, right?
Yeah, you can. That one's been converted. That was originally just a 2-minute machine. These are 4-minute cylinders here. Later on, they were able to make the grooves closer together, and they could make them in. So these play 4 minutes, whereas like your regular 45s and 78s and so forth, they only play like 3 minutes, and these play 4 minutes. You know.
But were they all this? There was only one type of machine for them, or
well,
could
just
play any cylinder on any machine?
Yeah, you could. Well, there was a few obscure brands that had different diameters on the inside,
Yeah.
so you couldn't put their cylinder on.
But most of them are probably Edison.
Most of them are Edison or Columbia. Columbia made a lot of them. Were the two big names in cylinder machines. But yeah, you can buy these pretty cheap usually. You'll see all the price. I mean, I've seen $25 and $35 a piece on these, you know, and they're just not
Well,
worth
the reason I
it.
ask this is I know with 78s, for example, apparently you have to use different kinds of needles for different types of
Well, for regular 78s, you can just use a regular. You can use a steel needle for any of them. But Edison made the diamond disc. They're disc machines.
Yeah.
And the only thing you could use those on was on an Edison machine
I see.
because they used a diamond on their point. The same way, the same kind of a diamond. This one here this later machine has a diamond point on it. And it gave a little bit more volume. And that, whereas this machine over here has a sapphire point. So, like the earlier wax records, you can play it on this machine, but you can't on that one because you can't play it on the one with the diamonds.
I see.
It will just ruin the record.
Yeah.
And same way you can't play an Edison diamond disc on a regular 78 machine because it'll just ruin it. And you'll see a lot of people put Edison diamond disc on this type of machine and play it with a steel needle. It just ruins the record right now.
The other thing I wanted to ask is, isn't it true that people used to, when they were recording, that the singers and all the musicians and everybody had to kind of gather
Oh
around
yeah, they had to be right up around the front. We have another program that we give on this called the recorded
First 50 years of
first 50 years of recorded music.
Yeah.
And we go into all that on that. But yeah, they had to record it directly off of onto the record.
So when you hear some of those discs that you play today with the marching and the crowd sounds and the coming from a distance and the truck, and that must have been a very complicated.
It was because they had to be all crowded right up around in front there until they came out with the electrical recording in probably 1926 when they first, late 1925, early 1926 they started coming out with what they call electrical recording, where they didn't have to be they could each have a microphone in front of them, so they didn't all have to be right up in front of the recording horn. See this machine here, I've got a head at home that you can put on here and put a wax blank on there, and you can stand in front of there and you can record on it.
They were selling those office machines not too long ago.
Pardon?
The Edison phone.
For it's office machine? Dictaphone.
Dictaphone.
Yeah, that's what they used in the offices. It was Edison made the dictaphone.
The cylinders had to be shaved.
Yeah, and they had to shave the cylinders off and they recorded on those. I'm sure some of you remember those. But
In fact, that's what Edison thought the future was in business rather than in
yeah,
entertainment.
he was so kind of stuck in the mud that he just thought of using it for business. He didn't care about entertainment. He wasn't much of a family man, to tell the truth. He just wasn't. He just wasn't what he was. He never slept. Maybe 2 to 4 hours a day is the most he ever slept. And he was never at home.
CDs are that way.
He was never at home. He spent all his time in his lab and stuff. So he had absolutely no family life.
Did he have a family?
Yeah, he had a family, but had a son.
He had a cubby hole in his shop when he curled up.
That he curled up in once in a while. But there was a lot of times when he'd go 24 hours and never sleep. All of his life he was that way.
As an old drill sergeant, I was interested in a different tempo, different cadence that they had. Some of these tramp, tramp, tramp. They started out just as like you were at the end of the march, and then they speeded up.
Which would be difficult to do, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I expect it the other way around.
Yeah, anybody, you can come up and play these. We really don't care. We have a lot of antiques and stuff. We live in a 3-story large house in the town. And we have a lot of antiques that we live with them and use them, and something gets broken, you know. That's the way it is. That concludes our program. So.